So a sad fact our generation has to face is this. Our kids are less cognitively capable than we were at their age.
Is America getting dumber? This cognitive neuroscientist says,
Gen Z is the first generation in modern history to underperform us on basically every cognitive measure we have, from basic attention to memory to literacy to numeracy to executive functioning to even general IQ, even though they go to more school than we did.
I remember watching the movie Idiocracy for the first time. It came out back in 2006, and the premise was pretty entertaining. That a half a millennium later, the population of the least intelligent people outgrows the smarter people. But who'd have thought that the next generation could be performing worse on cognitive tests than their parents? The performance scores have been steadily declining over the past decade. The 2024 Nations Report Card found that a third of 8th graders were below the basic reading level, and this figure is just at an all-time high. And we can't just scold the children because it's happening for the adults too. Adult literacy and numeracy skills have also declined or plateaued in most OECD countries for the past decade. So what exactly happened? Let's talk about reading comprehension. It doesn't help that Americans aren't reading as much for pleasure. And sometimes I think about this old post that Mark Zuckerberg posted on Facebook. It was a picture of himself and his dog when he was reading a book for hours. And I remember one commenter said something like, we're all here on Facebook, and this guy is literally reading an actual book. It's not terribly difficult to see people who do more reading for fun tend to do better on reading comprehension tests. But the medium we read on seems to matter a lot more than we think. This meta-analysis article synthesized a large number of studies on reading prints versus on digital devices like laptops and tablets. It found that digital reading can have a negative effect on reading comprehension, especially for younger children. But that doesn't seem to be the case for high school and college students. So why would the same word be harder on a screen? Print reading gives you the tactile experience of where you are in the book. But scrolling on screens, reading on a digital device takes away a lot of the physical cues. And we care a lot about the space, where we are in our book based on how thick the pages are. And when we're doing this on a screen, scrolling, every page looks the same. And if you happen to be on this page, I hope you subscribe and click the like button. I used to go to the bookstore a lot as a kid, and I remember smelling the books of all the books and reading in the corner and always loving the ambience, the smell of paper, and just being in the quiet space in my own little fictional world, absorbed into stories. And it's a shame that we don't have as many of those brick and mortar style bookstores around anymore. We saw that digital reading is particularly harmful for young children. They don't help engage higher order cognitive skills, especially during a critical period of child development. Our brain isn't optimized for learning when we flatten that learning into a 2D space and 2D screen. And that's bad news because the US government has already spent $30 billion on one-to-one device programs in schools. And we're not seeing the ROI that we were hoping to see. One of the brain regions that we know that support this learning in three-dimensional space is the hippocampus. This is where we found something called place cells. These are the cells that actually track the position of an animal while they're in a space. This is the region that is important for spatial memories and spatial navigation. They're so important for our agency, particularly for goal-related behavior. Scientists can even tag specific neurons that were active at one point in time and actually reactivate them later. Like tagging specific place cells that were active in specific places where mice learned to get a reward, and he learned those locations. You could then artificially activate those same neurons in another location where mouse never got a reward. And what the scientists have found is that that was enough to trick the mouse into thinking, hey, I'm going to get a reward. So he started sticking its tongue out and start licking because it thinks that it's going to get a reward, the milk. A new study shows just how precise these memory systems really are. By tagging and reactivating groups of neurons, they could cause freezing in mice learning a fearful cue. different neurons represent different time points of the learning process, and they are generally don't overlap. And given these incredibly complex and precise memory systems that we have at work, when we use a 2D screen, we're actually underutilizing what the brain is capable of. Now, the latest technology wave is the generative AI. When it first came out, initially there was a lot of hope and a lot of promise to be delivered in the schools, in education. But now we're realizing how far from that to be actually realized. Generative AI might give a short-term performance boost, but doesn't lead to actual learning. For example, one study found that ChatGPT 4 significantly improved performance by 48% by ChatGPT base and even 127% for GPT Tutor. But then when these tools were taken away for an exam, students actually perform worse than those who never had access in the first place. So what does that tell you? We might be using these tools as kind of a cognitive clutch, but we've known for a while that digital amnesia, which is the same thing as the Google effect, as people call it, is when we are forgetting information just as quickly as we see them because we know exactly where to go get it. We just have to do a Google search, right? It's so easy now. We can just ask the AI to figure out where the information is, that we don't really learn anything and we don't really retain any information because we don't have to. Pen on paper, not typing, but actually writing things out with pen on paper. Handwriting actually helps clarify our thinking. It also helps you learn better.
When we let kids draft their essays on a screen versus they have to draft on a pen and paper and then they can transfer it to a screen later, you always see better thinking with this.
What better way to practice this than to do it to improve your own habits for your goals? Well, I designed this 12-week goal and life planner for my clients just for this reason. And you can take a break from the screens. You can start writing about your goals, exactly what you visualize in your life. Give your brain a breather to think more creatively. What could you do to make your life over the top awesome this week? Well, this is a great starting point if you want to do that on your own. You can grab them on my website. I have a link in the description. But what's more concerning is to see how easy it is to be manipulated by these AI tools. This new paper in Science Advances, experimenters tested biased AI autocomplete suggestions while students wrote about controversial issues like, should we have death penalty? Or should felons have voting rights? And the AI was able to successfully nudge people's attitudes toward its own position by 0.44 point on a 5-point rating scale, which doesn't seem like much, but it's still statistically significant after adjusting for multiple comparisons. And this happened even for students who didn't actually accept any of the suggestions. But what worries me more than this is that students didn't believe that they were ever influenced at all, and they thought the suggestions were reasonable and balanced. They didn't agree that AI would have changed their position, and they were pretty much unaware of the influence of AI. We develop tools to make our lives easier. But when it comes to making our cognitive activities easier, we're actually not growing it. We're not developing it. We need to seriously think about what we might be trading away, right? Deep thinking takes effort. It's like going to the gym. If you're trying to build a muscle, it requires effort to work hard at it. It's not fun. It's not always easy, but we have to take this hard part into practice so that we can appreciate it more.
The one thing tech does is get rid of the effort and the energy we need to make sure learning is working.
The effort in our work is what makes us appreciate more. And I talked about this in my previous video that you can check it out if you haven't seen it. Speaking of AI and its massive potential impact on our economy, here's a psychology experiment. We're living in an age of abundant intelligence, unlike anything we've ever experienced before. And there could be some catastrophic results. There's this blog post by Citrini Research that's called The 2028 Global Intelligence Crisis. It just came out a few weeks ago, but the whole post is written as if we're in the summer of 2028. And if you haven't read it, I recommend giving it a read because it paints a pretty vivid and terrifying picture of what the future could look like with AI being at the heart of the entire economy. One mechanism that this could happen, as it points out, is this lack of a natural break in the entire feedback loop with the AI. As AI becomes more capable, this makes a even more difficult problem to solve and try to stop it. The traditional flow of supply and demand fluctuations that are pretty easy to self-correct. But with AI, it's not that simple. With companies increase AI investment, AI capabilities expand, as we know that it can double after a few months, and workers are laid off because they're not needed as much, then these displaced white-collar workers have less money to consume, they spend less, then companies make less revenue, and these companies end up having to invest more in AI to squeeze the productivity out of it even further. So there's no end in sight. That's what makes it so unique and different about this AI in our economy. And at the same time, these white collar workers can flood the gig economy, like driving Uber and things like that, which lowers the hourly rate in the gig economy due to oversupply. So all of this feels pretty dark. But this isn't totally off base, according to this study. It claims that generative AI may create a socioeconomic tipping point through labor displacement. Economists use the capital to labor ratio, which is essentially the amount of capital that's available per unit labor in the production process. It's a kind of an economic indicator that gives insights into labor efficiency. Well, with AI companies are pumping so much capital into AI development to supposedly improve more productivity, right? So this increases the numerator, the capital, but then it also decreases the denominator because heavy AI investment likely brings down the need for actual hours for labor. This study used Australian data for recession simulations that show that this is unsustainable. What they found is that disposable income per capita would be reduced and underutilized workers will increase, with some rate differences depending on how large the AI capital to labor ratio is. Underutilized workers come with less disposable income, which will bring out reduced spending and potentially trigger a recession. So the impact of this is that at some point we hit a point where the new job creation due to AI can't possibly keep up with all these displaced underutilized workers and reduce consumption as a whole.
In a way, the January report was a positive surprise, and the February report was a negative surprise. If you put them together, you get something in the middle, and I think you have to really, as you do, I'm sure, realize there was a strike and there was weather, and that's about 80,000 of the negative effect total on the February report. Notwithstanding that, so what do you see if you take a step back overall? There are a number of indicators that suggest a degree of stability, but the thing that I think good number of people on the committee are concerned about is just the very, very low level of job creation. If you adjust what has been the trend job creation over the past, let's say, 6 months, if you adjust that for what we think, our staff thinks, is the overstatement due to overcounting, effectively there's zero net job creation in the private sector. But actually that looks like that's about what the economy needs in terms of dealing with very, very low, non-existent really, growth in the labor force, which of course we've never had in our history. So you've got a sort of a zero employment growth equilibrium. But ultimately, though, you can argue that it's a consequence of deliberate policy, which is really the changes to immigration. That's the biggest factor there.
Well, all of this is pretty frightening to think about, especially from a policy perspective. This is almost the opposite of the original Idiocracy problem, because we're talking about all the highly educated, pretty smart people being displaced here and being underutilized here. I'm not an economist, but the economy is something that affects all of us. And so we should care about it and talk about it. And you can think of this as one of our collective exercise, let's say, to think more deeply.
just remember that we don't know, and we shouldn't assume it's going to be one thing or another. We're going to see.
What should the US government do to fix these potential problems ahead? Don't let the AI ruin our ability to think more deeply, think critically, think creatively, and solve problems, because we're right here, we're facing it.
How do human beings learn? And we now have the clear understanding of why tech does not work for learning, and it is all biological. It's not that the tech isn't being used well enough, we haven't been trained enough, we need better programs. It's we have evolved biologically to learn from other human beings, not from screens. And screens circumvent that process. I guarantee all of us at one point took a test on reading comprehension. And the way it looked is this. Here's a passage of about 750 words. Here are 10 to 12 questions about that passage. Most of them are inferential, not factual. They're asking you to go beyond what you just read to see what you understood. Cool. Last year, the SATs had a reading comprehension section. Here's what it looked like. Here is a single sentence of 75 words. Here is one question, fact-based, about that sentence. Next. Here is another sentence of 75 words. Here is one question about that sentence. Next. Last year, they redefined reading comprehension to mean 54 short sentences with one question about each. That is skimming. That's not reading. Why would we ever do that? Because what do kids do on computers? They skim. So rather than determining what do we want our children to do and gearing education towards that, we are redefining education to better suit the tool. That's not progress, that is surrender.
I'd love to hear what you're thinking in the comments. Looking forward to the discussion.